My father died on a Tuesday, and 11 days later his widow handed me a piece of paper that would have erased me from his life. She called it a codicil. She said it was his final wish. She said he'd signed it. I'm Mara Ellison. I'm 26, and I work as a paralegal in the trust and estate department of a law firm in Sacramento, which means I spend my days reading other people's last wishes and spotting the ones that were never real. The paper she gave me had a watermark in the corner that said draft, and a signature line where my father's name should have been that was blank, and a notary stamp dated 3 weeks after the day his doctor said he could no longer hold a pen. I did not raise my voice. I am paid to notice things other people miss, and what I noticed was that the document trying to take my inheritance was, in the eyes of the law, a ghost. People think a will is a sacred thing. It isn't. A will is a document, and a document is only as real as the rules it was made under. I learned that in my first month on the job, when a senior partner slid a thick file across my desk and said, "Mara, anyone can type the words, I leave everything to my goldfish. Your job is to find the part where the law says that doesn't count. The part where it doesn't count is almost always in the small print nobody reads." Clarice, my stepmother, had read the big print. She had not read the small print. That was her mistake, and it was the only one I needed. My father's name was Robert. He built decks for a living, redwood and cedar, and he built them square because he believed a crooked line was a lie you could see. He taught me to read contracts the way he read a board before he cut it slow, from the end looking for the knot that would split under pressure. The knot in Clarissa's codicil was the signature line, and it was empty, and I was the daughter who had been trained, by the man she was trying to erase, to find exactly that. The house I grew up in is still on Birchwood Avenue. My father bought it in 1998, the year before I was born, with money he saved from a decade of Saturdays spent hauling lumber. When he married Clarice in 2019, he did not change the deed. When he set up the trust in 2015, he named me as the beneficiary of everything, with a letter that said, "For Mara, who reads to the end." Clarice was not in that letter. Clarice was not in that trust. The codicil she handed me 11 days after he died was her attempt to write herself in, and it failed at the one place that mattered most. I want to be clear about something, because the quiet part of this story is the part people get wrong. I did not hate my stepmother. I did not storm her house or scream at my half-sister. I took the paper, I said thank you, and I went to my office and I opened the file that held the truth. That is what a paralegal does. We are the ones who read to the end. If you have ever been the person in your family who reads the fine print while everyone else nods along, hit like and subscribe. Leave a comment and tell me what city you're in and what time it is where you are. I read them. Now let me take you back to where this really started, which for my father was long before Clarice, and for me was the day he taught me that a crooked line is a lie. Let me take you back to 1998, to a 2-bedroom house on Birchwood Avenue with fresh redwood stairs that smelled like sawdust, and a man who measured twice and cut once. My father was 31, newly a father to a daughter who wasn't born yet, and married to my mother, Diane, who painted the kitchen the color of weak tea and said it was warm. Robert Ellison was not a rich man, he was a careful one. He kept a ledger, not on a computer but in a black notebook with his handwriting, every job, every board, every dollar, because he believed that if you couldn't account for a thing you didn't really own it. In 2015, when I was 15, he sat me down at the kitchen table and showed me the trust he'd had a lawyer draw up. "This is the document that says what happens to everything I built," he said. "Read it. Tell me if it's square." I read it. It left the Birchwood house, his tools, his small retirement account, and the life insurance to me, with Diana's successor if anything happened to him. It said, in plain language, that no future spouse would have a claim unless he amended it in writing, signed and notarized, while of sound mind. He looked at me over the top of the page and said, "The law loves a paper trail, Mara. Give it one and it'll love you back." I was 15. I thought it was a boring old man thing. I was 22 before I understood he was handing me the only weapon I'd ever need. He and Diane separated when I was 17. Not a fire, a cooling. They'd grown into different silences. The divorce was clean, the trust untouched, and he kept the house because the house was mine in the document, and he said a promise to a child counts more than a promise to a spouse. I stayed with him on weekends and holidays, and on the weekdays I learned to read the way he did, because by then I was already volunteering at the firm where my mother's friend worked, filing wills, and I loved the certainty of a page that said what it meant. Clarice entered in 2018 at a hardware store of all places. My father was buying hinges, she was returning a faucet. She laughed at something he said about torque, and he came home and mentioned her name like a man mentioning a song he couldn't get out of his head. They married in 2019, a small ceremony, and I stood beside him and I was happy for him because he deserved a second warm silence. What I did not know, what none of us knew, was that Clarice had a daughter named Tessa from a previous marriage, and Tessa had a way of needing things, and Clarice had a way of believing the big print and ignoring the small. My mother, Diane, deserves a word here, because she is the reason I could read it all. She painted houses for a living, the interiors, the warm colors, and she taught me that a room is a promise about how life will feel inside it. When she and my father separated, she did not fight over the Birchwood house, because the trust said it was mine, and she trusted a square document over a sentimental fight. That restraint is the rarest thing in a divorce, and I learned it from her. You don't win by grabbing, you win by reading what was already written. She remarried a botanist named Hal who grew orchids in a greenhouse behind their Davis house, and she was happy. And I was happy for her, and the only fracture in our little constellation was the one Clarice would later try to pry open. I was the kind of child who read the back of the cereal box and the warranty on the toaster, not because I was strange, but because my father had trained the instinct before I had words for it at the firm where my mother's friend worked, filing wills as a volunteer at 16. I found a kind of peace in documents that said what they meant. The world outside was loud and uncertain. The page was quiet and exact. A will either left the house to you or it didn't. There was no argument in the margin. I built my younger self there, in the silence of the file room, and when Clarice later waved a codicil at me, I was already the person who would turn to the signature line first, even though I trained myself to read the body first, because the body tells you what the signature is supposed to do, and the signature tells you whether it did. The firm is called Hartwell & Cho, and it sits on the 8th floor of a building downtown where the windows look out at the Capitol Dome and the fluorescent lights hum like a distant traffic jam. I've been there 4 years. I started as a file clerk and worked up to trust and estate, which is the department that handles the paper people leave behind. My desk faces a wall of cabinets, each drawer a life, and my job is to make sure those lives are read correctly. The senior partner who trained me, Mr. Okafor, has been doing this for 30 years and has a rule he repeats like a prayer. A document is either executed or it is not. There is no in between. Find the execution and you find the truth. I want to be fair to Clarice, because fairness is the job and fairness is the family I come from. She is 51, a retired dental hygienist, and when she married my father, she seemed genuinely fond of him. She brought casseroles, she learned to love his sawdust, she called me on my birthday. For the first year I thought she was a gift, the way my father thought. The problem with gifts, as I've learned, is that some of them come with a silent invoice. Tessa was the invoice. Tessa was 24, between jobs, between apartments, between plans, and she had a way of appearing at Birchwood Avenue right when money was being discussed. My father's health declined the way a deck rots. Slowly, then all at once. In 2021, he was diagnosed with a neurological condition that the doctors described with words like progressive and cognitive. By 2023, he could still build a straight line, but he forgot the names of his own tools. By early 2024, his doctor, Dr. Vance, wrote a note in his chart that said he was no longer able to manage his financial affairs, and that note is dated the 14th of March, 2024. I remember the date because I was the one who filed the copy my father gave me, the one he'd had the foresight to sign while he still could, naming me his agent under a durable power of attorney for exactly this kind of day. The family map if you're keeping score: Robert, my father, the builder, now declining. Diane, my mother, the painter, living in Davis and remarried to a botanist. Clarice, the widow, in the Birchwood house. Tessa, the stepsister, couch surfing toward an inheritance. And me, Mara, the paralegal, the one who reads to the end. 4 women and 1 dying man, and only one of us knew what a properly executed document looked like. Clarice took over the household in 2024 the way ivy takes over a wall, gently, completely, and by the time anyone noticed the wall was gone, it was too late to pull it back. She managed his medications, his appointments, his checkbook. My father, who had taught me that a crooked line is a lie, was now living inside a house run by a woman who believed the big print and ignored the small. I visited every Sunday. I brought him crossword puzzles he could no longer finish. I watched Clarice answer the phone for him, speak for him, sign for him, and I told myself it was care. That's the part people don't understand about quiet theft. It wears the clothes of kindness until the kindness is the only thing left to steal. The trust, the real one from 2015, sat in a filing cabinet at Hartwell & Cho under for Ellison. I had read it 100 times. It was square, it named me, it excluded any spouse not named, and it said amendments required a signed, dated, notarized writing made while the grantor was of sound mind. My father had never made such an amendment. I would have known. I was the one who filed his papers. The only document that mentioned Clarice at all was the prenuptial agreement from 2019, which gave her the right to live in the Birchwood house for her lifetime, but said nothing about owning it, and explicitly stated that the trust governed the disposition of all assets. She had signed that. She had read the big print. She had missed the part where it said the trust wins. In the fall of 2024, Clarice started asking me questions that a widow shouldn't need to ask a paralegal. "Does a will override a trust?" she said. One Sunday, over a casserole. "Your father mentioned something about changing things for Tessa," I said. Careful. "If he changed the trust, there'd be a signed writing. Have you seen one?" she said. "He talked about it. He meant to. Meant to is not signed. Meant to is a ghost." But I filed the question in my mind the way my father filed his dollars, because I had learned from him that you account for a thing even if you don't own it yet. Tessa visited more that winter. She brought nothing. She took the good chair. She spoke to my father like he was a bank with a forgotten password. I watched her one afternoon scroll through his phone, and I watched Clarice watch her and say nothing, and I understood the shape of it. A daughter who needed, a mother who enabled, and a sick man who could no longer read to the end. The only person in that room who could read to the end was me, and I was the one they'd forgotten was listening. The first case Mr. Okafor ever gave me was almost this exact shape. A widow brought a codicil leaving her late husband's tools to a neighbor, and she swore he'd signed it the week before he died. I pulled the original trust, saw the amendment required 2 witnesses, and noticed the codicil had 1 signature witness and a date that fell after the death certificate. "Dead men don't sign," Mr. Okafor said, and we filed to admit the trust as written. That case taught me the grammar of these fights. The body of a will is theater, but the execution is law, and the execution is always in the small print. I did not know then that I was learning to defend my own father's paper. My father's decline had its own grammar too, and I watched it the way a builder watches a joist sag. In the spring of 2023, he built a planter box and forgot halfway through which end was the front, and laughed it off as tiredness. By the fall, he could no longer balance his own checkbook, the black notebook abandoned on a shelf, its last entry a number he'd written twice and crossed out. Clarice took the notebook down and said she'd handle the bills, and I, visiting that Sunday, said nothing, because he looked content, and content was rare, and I mistook peace for safety. That is the trap in these stories. The victim looks happy because the theft is dressed as care, and the people who love them mistake the costume for the person. For the first year, Clarice was genuine. She learned his medications, she drove him to the Y for the water exercise he loved, she laughed at his jokes about torque. I credit her for that year. The shift came in 2024 after the incapacity note, when the caring hardened into control. She began answering for him on the phone. She began speaking in the voice that used to be his, and Tessa began appearing with her hand out. "Mom said Dad wants me to have the truck," Tessa said once, and my father, in the chair by the window, said nothing, because by then saying nothing was all he could do, and they read his silence as yes. The truck was a small thing, a 2009 Silverado he'd kept for job sites, worth maybe $4,000. Clarice signed it over to Tessa using the power of attorney my father had given her for care, not conveyance, and Tessa sold it within a month. I found out from a neighbor who saw the for sale sign. I confronted Clarice gently, and she said he would have wanted her to have it. He always said family comes first. Family comes first is the sentence every quiet thief learns because it sounds like love and functions like a key. I did not argue. I filed it the way my father filed his dollars, because I had learned that you account for a thing even before you own the right to stop it. My own dilemma in those months was the kind paralegals are not trained for. I could see the shape of what was coming. I could see Tessa's hand and Clarice's silence and the absence of any signed amendment, but my father had not asked me to police his wife. He had asked me, in the durable power of attorney, to act for him if he could not. And so the question became not whether something was wrong, but when the line was crossed from care into conversion, and who got to draw it. I drew it quietly, the day he died and the codicil appeared, because by then the conversion was complete, and the only thing left to defend was the paper he'd built square. My father died on a Tuesday in January 2025. The call came at 6:12 in the morning. Clarissa's voice was calm, which struck me even then as wrong, and she said, "He went quietly in his sleep." Tessa was here. I drove to Birchwood through a fog so thick the streetlights looked like moons, and I stood in the kitchen where I'd learned to read a contract, and I felt the house already shifting, like a deck with a loosened joist. The first week was grief, and grief is its own kind of fog. The second week, Clarice called me to the house and sat me at the kitchen table, the same table where my father had shown me the trust. She slid a document across the wood. "Your father wanted you to have this," she said. "He signed it last spring. It changes the trust so Tessa and I are taken care of. He was worried about you, you know. Thought you were too young to handle it all." The document was 3 pages. At the top it said codicil to the Robert Ellison Revocable Trust. In the corner, faint, was a watermark. Draft. I did not look at the signature line first. A good paralegal reads the body before the signature, because the body tells you what the signature is supposed to do. The codicil said that upon my father's death, the Birchwood house, the retirement account, and the life insurance would go to Clarice and Tessa equally, and that my interest under the 2015 trust was hereby revoked. It was typed clean, the big print bold and confident. It was on its face a complete erasure of me. I turned to the signature page. The line for Robert Ellison was blank. Not forged, not scribbled, blank. Beneath it, a notary block showed a stamp and a date, the 2nd of April 2024. I knew 2 things instantly. First, my father's doctor had declared him unable to manage finances on the 14th of March, 2024, which meant even a real signature in April would be contestable. Second, the signature wasn't there at all. The notary had stamped a page with no signature, which is like a receipt for nothing. I looked up at Clarice. She was watching me the way a person watches someone read a lie. "They've been told is true. He signed it," she said, quieter. The pen slipped, or the page got copied." I said, "This page has no signature, Clarice." She said, "The original does. This is a copy." I said, "A copy of a signed page would show the signature. This shows the line." She stood up. "You're being difficult, Mara. After all we've done for you, all they'd done was marry my father and wait for him to die." Tessa came into the kitchen then, and she said loud, "Dad said it was ours. He told me in the hospital, he said the house is mine." My father had not been in a hospital, he had died at home in his sleep. The lie was clumsy, which told me they'd rehearsed it badly, and bad rehearsal is its own evidence. I folded the codicil, I said thank you, and I left. In my car, I sat with the document on the passenger seat, and I counted to 10 the way Mr. Okafor taught me, because the first rule of a paralegal is that you do not act from the feeling, you act from the file. The week between taking the codicil and opening the firm's file was the longest of my life, and I spent it doing the only thing a paralegal knows how to do with a dangerous paper. I documented the danger around it. Clarice called me 2 days after the kitchen table. "Have you shown the codicil to anyone?" she asked. Casual, the way a person asks if you've told on them without saying the word. I said, "I'm reviewing it," she said. "Good, Tessa's anxious." "She's been through so much," I said. "I understand," and I wrote down the time of the call, because a pattern of anxious calls from the beneficiary of a document is itself a kind of evidence, the kind that shows someone is watching whether the paper will hold. Tessa cornered me at the funeral reception, in the hallway by the coats, and she said, "You're not going to fight us on this, are you? Dad wanted us taken care of. He said so." I said, "What did he say exactly?" She paused, then repeated the hospital lie, the house is mine line, and I watched her eyes when she said it, because liars have a tell at the pronoun. She said, "Dad said the way you recite a fact you were told to recite, not a memory you own." My father had a different tell. He'd said, "I built it square like a man describing his own hands." The difference is everything, and I had heard both. I did not argue at the reception. I went home and I wrote a contemporaneous note, dated, timed, describing the conversation, because a paralegal's own notes made close to the event are admissible and credible in a way a later recollection is not. I noted that Tessa claimed a hospital statement my father never made, that Clarice had called to monitor my review, and that neither had produced a signed original. The note was 1 page. "It is in the file." It is the first thing Mr. Okafor read when I laid the file on his desk, and he said, "You've been doing this longer than you think." The third thing that happened that week was the quietest and the most important. I went to the Birchwood house on Sunday, my usual day, and I sat with my father's absence the way you sit with a missing stare. Clarice was in the kitchen, and on the counter, half under a casserole dish, was a second copy of the codicil, a photocopy, and on it, in the margin, in my father's handwriting, was a single word, number. Not a signature, a refusal. Dated, faintly, what looked like early 2024. I did not take it. I did not photograph it without permission. I memorized it and I wrote it in my note that night, that a copy existed with a handwritten no in Robert Ellison's hand, and that Clarice had left it sitting under a dish, either careless or confident that no one who mattered would read it. I was the one who mattered, and I had read it. That no became the spine of the case. A grantor's own handwritten rejection of the change, even on a copy, is powerful evidence of intent, and intent is the one thing a blank signature line cannot fake. I did not need the NO to win, the execution failures alone were enough. But the NO was the human center of the story, the proof that my father had seen the attempt and refused it, and that the document trying to erase me was not only unsigned but refused. I told Mr. Okafor about it, and he said, "Get it properly, subpoena the house if you must, but lead with the execution. The NO is the heart, the blank line is the law." So I led with the law and kept the heart for the hearing. That week, I built the habit that would carry the whole fight. I did not raise my voice, I did not accuse, I did not warn them what was coming. I let them believe the big print. I read the small, and in the small, my father had already written the answer, in a shaky hand, on a copy, under a casserole dish, where only someone who read to the end would think to look. That was the line that made me stop asking and start reading. I went to the office the next morning, before anyone else, and I pulled the Ellison file from the cabinet. The 2015 trust was there, square and certain, signed Robert Ellison, dated, notarized, witnessed by two neighbors whose names I knew from the block. It named me, it excluded spouses not named. It required amendments to be signed, dated, notarized, sound mind. None of that had changed. I laid the codicil Clarice had given me next to it, and the contrast was a kind of violence. One document built like a deck, the other typed like a wish. I examined the codicil the way Mr. Okafor taught me, line by line looking for the knot. The watermark said draft, which meant this was a working copy, never finalized. The signature line was blank, which meant Robert Ellison had never executed it. The notary stamp was dated the 2nd of April, 2024, 3 weeks after Dr. Vance's incapacity note, which meant even if a signature had existed, it would have been made when he could no longer manage his affairs. And the notary's commission number, printed small at the bottom. I ran through the state database that afternoon. It belonged to a notary whose license had lapsed in 2022. A stamp from a dead commission, on a blank line, on a draft. The document was a ghost wearing a costume? I went deeper, because a paralegal who stops at the first knot misses the second. I requested my father's medical records under the power of attorney he'd signed, and Dr. Vance confirmed in writing what the chart said. Robert Ellison was declared incapacitated for financial purposes on the 14th of March 2024 and declined steadily after. I requested the call logs from his phone carrier, and I found that on the dates Tessa claimed he'd said the house is mine in the hospital, there were no hospital calls at all, only calls to and from Clarice's number, clustered in the evenings, the kind of pattern that looks like coaching. The prenuptial agreement from 2019 was the final nail. I read it again, slowly, from the end. It gave Clarice a lifetime right to live in the Birchwood house. It said nothing about owning it. And in Section 6, in language a paralegal learns to love, it stated, "All assets of Robert Ellison shall be governed exclusively by the revocable trust dated 2015, and no spouse shall acquire an interest in the trust, except as expressly provided therein." Clarice had signed that, she had read the big print, the part about living in the house, and she had missed the small print, the part where the trust wins and she loses. Her own signature was the evidence against her. I built the file the way my father built a deck, square. From the ground up, I made a timeline, the 14th of March, 2024, incapacity, the 2nd of April, 2024, fake notary stamp on a blank page. The codicil unsigned, undated in the body, watermarked, draft. The trust, ironclad, naming me. The prenup, excluding her. I printed it all on the firm's heavy paper. I tabbed it. I wrote a one-page memo in plain English titled, "Why the codicil is not valid," and I put a red tab on the blank signature line because red is for the thing you don't want to see and can't look away from. I did not call Clarice. I did not call Tessa. I called Mr. Okafor, and I put the file on his desk, and he read it standing, then sitting. Then he said the words I'd been hoping to hear. "It's square, Mara. You've got them." He meant I had the law. The law loves a paper trail, and I had laid one from the incapacity note to the blank line, and it led nowhere they could stand. The total value at stake was not small. The Birchwood house was worth roughly $420,000. The retirement account held about $110,000. The life insurance paid $250,000. That's $780,000. That the codicil, had it been real, would have moved from me to them. 780,000 attempted through a draft with a blank line and a dead notary. The size of the lie is not the size of the proof. The proof was a single empty space where a name should be. I did not stop at the file on my desk. A paralegal who stops at the first knot misses the second, and I went looking for the people who had touched the real paper. The 2015 trust had been witnessed by two neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Kwan, who lived 3 doors down and had known my father since the house was framed. I drove to their porch on a Saturday, and I asked, carefully, if they remembered witnessing his trust. Mrs. Kwan, 82, sharp as a chisel, said, "Robert had us sign because he said his girl needed protecting. He said, if anyone ever shows you a paper that says otherwise, you tell them I built it square." I wrote that down. A witness who remembers the grantor's intent is worth more than a notary who stamps a blank line, and the Kwans remembered. The notary, the one with the lapsed 2022 commission, I traced through the state database to a name, a woman who had done wills and notary out of a strip mall office that had closed in 2023. I called the number on file. It rang to a disconnected line. I requested her commission record through the firm's access, and it confirmed, commission 2018, expired 2022, never renewed. A stamp from an expired commission is not a notarization, it is a picture of one. The codicil's notary block was a photograph of authority, printed on a draft, on a blank line, dated after my father could no longer hold a pen. 3 failures stacked, and any one of them was fatal. The phone records told the third story. On the evenings Tessa claimed my father had spoken to her in a hospital. The only calls from his line were to Clarice, and Clarice's line showed calls to Tessa immediately after, a ping-pong that reads, "To anyone who has filed a coercion case, like coaching." I mapped it. Clarice speaks to Robert. Clarice speaks to Tessa. Tessa later repeats a statement as if Robert said it. The statement is about the house. The house is in the trust she cannot touch. The codicil is the tool to touch it, and the codicil is blank. The pattern was not proof of fraud by itself, but it was the thread that unraveled the story they'd rehearsed, and I pulled it slowly, the way my father pulled a crooked nail. I took the whole file to Mr. Okafor and I asked him formally to review it as supervising attorney. He read the timeline, the medical note, the notary record, the call map, the Kwan's statement, and the prenup. He said, "You've got execution failure on 4 fronts, a witness to intent, and a conflicting signed agreement. If they fight it, they lose. If they don't, you administer and move on." He wrote a cover memo endorsing the petition, and his signature on a firm letterhead is the kind of small print that opponents learn to fear. I had built the deck square, he had stamped it sound. I want to tell you about the memo, because the memo is where a paralegal's heart meets the law, and where mine nearly broke. I sat at my kitchen table, the same kind of table my father had used, and I wrote, "Why the codicil is not valid," in plain English, the way he would have wanted, the way a person who is not a lawyer could read. I listed the 4 grounds in order of strength. First, no signature. The line is blank, and under Probate Code Section 6110 a will or codicil must be signed by the testator. Second, no sound mind. The incapacity note predates the notary date by 3 weeks. Third, invalid notary. The commission lapsed in 2022, so the stamp is meaningless. Fourth, conflict with the prenup. The 2019 agreement says the trust governs, and Clarice signed it. Any one of the 4 stands alone. Together, they are a wall. Writing it, I felt something I had not expected. Grief, not anger. Not grief for the money, which was never the point, but grief for my father who had built a square thing and trusted a woman who read only the big print, and grief for the version of our family that might have been, if Clarice had been content with the lifetime right to live in the house, he'd gladly given her. He had given her a home. She had tried to take the rest. The memo was my way of saying, to him and to the court, that the home was hers and the rest was mine, exactly as he'd built it. I printed the file on the firm's heavy paper, the kind that survives a decade in a drawer, and I tabbed each section with a colored tab, red for the blank line, blue for the incapacity note, green for the notary record, yellow for the prenup. Mr. Okafor saw the tabs and smiled, the small one, and said, "You've been doing this longer than you think. The tabs are not legally required. They are a kindness to the judge, who will read 100 pages this week and remember the red one. A paralegal who helps the judge see the knot is a paralegal who wins, and I had learned from my father that the person who points at the crooked line quietly is the person the line answers to." The night before the hearing, I read the whole file aloud to an empty kitchen, the way my father had made me read the trust at 15. I read the trust square. I read the codicil blank. I read the no, refusing. And I said the way he would have it square, Dad. The empty room did not answer, but the paper did, the way it always does for the person who reads to the end. The law loves a paper trail. I had laid one from his hand to mine, and it held. I did not scream. I filed. Mr. Okafor and I petitioned the probate court to admit the 2015 trust as the governing instrument, and to declare the purported codicil invalid on 4 independent grounds: no signature, no sound mind, invalid notary, and conflict with the controlling prenuptial agreement. We attached the timeline, the medical note, the notary database result, and the prenup. The petition asked the court to confirm me as the sole beneficiary and to appoint a neutral trustee, because Clarice, as the widow residing in the house, had a clear conflict. Clarice, through a lawyer she hired the week after, filed a response claiming the codicil was real and that I was a grieving daughter trying to erase her father's true wishes. Her lawyer was a man named Pell who specialized in exactly this kind of fight, and he opened by trying to rattle me in a phone call. "You're 26, he said. "You don't want to do this to your family." I said, "I'm not doing it to my family. I'm doing it to a document. The document is doing it to me." He had no answer to that, because a paralegal knows the difference between a person and a paper, and he'd mistaken me for someone who confused the two. The hearing was set for a Thursday at 9:30 in the morning, which is a civilized time for a life to be defended. I dressed in the navy blazer my father had liked, the one he'd called square, and I brought the file, and Mr. Okafor brought his 30 years. Clarice sat with Tessa and Pell. My mother, Diane, flew in from Davis and sat behind me, and her presence was a kind of ballast. The judge was a man with a quiet voice who read documents the way I do from the end. Pell went first. He held up the codicil and said, "Mr. Ellison's intent is clear. He wanted his wife and stepdaughter provided for." The signature, he argued, was lost in copying. The judge held the page up to the light, saw the Driaraft watermark, and said, "Mr. Pell, where is the signature?" Pell said, "We believe a signed original exists." The judge said, "Produce it." Pell could not. I stood, and I held up the 2015 trust, and I said, "Your Honor, the governing instrument requires a signed, dated, notarized amendment made while the grantor was of sound mind. The purported codicil has no signature, a notary whose commission lapsed in 2022, and a date 3 weeks after the grantor was declared incapacitated. It is not executed. Under Probate Code Section 6110, it is not a will, it is a draft." The judge asked Clarice 3 questions. First, "Mrs. Ellison, did your husband sign this page in your presence?" She said, "He meant to. He signed it at the kitchen table." Second, "Can you produce that signed page?" She said, "Tessa has it, or it was copied wrong." Third, "Did you read the prenuptial agreement you signed in 2019? She said, "I read the part about the house." The judge said, "The part you didn't read says the trust governs. You signed that too." Clarice looked at Tessa, and Tessa looked at her lap, and the silence in that courtroom was the sound of a ghost dissolving. The judge ruled from the bench. He admitted the 2015 trust. He declared the codicil invalid on all 4 grounds. He confirmed me as beneficiary and appointed a neutral trustee to administer the estate and to manage Clarice's lifetime right to reside in the house, with the explicit note that she could live there but could not sell, encumber, or transfer it. He referred the matter of the forged notary stamp to the district attorney's fraud unit because a dead commission stamp on a deathbed document is not carelessness, it is a crime. I did not smile, I did not gloat. When the gavel fell, I folded my file and I thought of my father at the kitchen table saying the law loves a paper trail. I had given it one and it had loved me back. Mr. Okafor squeezed my shoulder on the way out, which is the most a man like him will ever celebrate, and it was enough. The trustee, a calm woman named Miss Brandt, took over the house the following month. Clarice kept her lifetime right to live there, which my father's prenup had granted and the judge had honored, and I honored too, because I am my father's daughter, and a promise to a spouse counts for something, even when the spouse broke the bigger one. Tessa moved out within a week, to a friend's couch, and I have not seen her since. Clarice stayed in the Birchwood house, and I drove past it once and saw the redwood stairs my father built still square, still holding, and I understood that some things he made would outlast the people who tried to undo them. The money landed where the trust said it would. The life insurance paid to the trust. The retirement account transferred clean, the house remained, and when I am ready I will sell it or keep it, but the decision is mine, made square, the way he taught. I set aside a portion for the botanist's stepfather's greenhouse fund at my mother's request, and I kept the rest, and I felt, for the first time, that the number on the page matched the number in my head, the way Mrs. Ito used to say she wanted. My mother and I grew closer through it. She had remarried a gentle man who grew orchids, and she told me one evening that she'd always known I'd be the one to hold the line. "Your father saw it in you," she said. "The way you read, you were the only one of us who read to the end." I hadn't known he'd said that to her. It made the navy blazer feel less like armor and more like a hand on my shoulder. I kept working at Hartwell and Cho. Mr. Okafor gave me the Ellison file to keep, and it sits on my shelf, tabbed in red, a reminder that the quiet part of the job is the part that wins. New paralegals ask me how I stay so calm in probate fights, and I tell them what my father told me. A document is either executed or it isn't, and your job is to find the execution. When you find it, you don't need to raise your voice. The paper does the shouting. I think often about the blank line, not the lie, the empty space. A person can type 1,000 confident words, can stamp a dead notary, can rehearse a clumsy story about a hospital that never happened, and still lose to a single place where a name should be and isn't. That is the whole lesson of an estate. The absence of a signature is not nothing. It is everything. It is the difference between a wish and a will, between a ghost and a person, between a daughter erased and a daughter who reads to the end. Clarice and I do not speak. There is a silence there, but it is not the cold kind. It is the kind that means we both know exactly what happened and we have both chosen the side of the document. She read the big print and missed the small. I read the small and found the blank. The law did not pick a side between us as people. It picked the side of the properly executed paper, and that paper was my father's, and it named me. I have been asked since whether I forgive Clarice. Forgiveness is a word people use to end a conversation they don't want to have. I will tell you what I know instead. She read the big print and missed the small, and the small print was the part where my father said the trust wins. She is living in the house he gave her the right to live in, and she is not living in the house he gave me the right to own, and that balance is exactly what a square document produces. I don't need to forgive the big print, I only need to defend the small one. The law did that. I helped. If this reminded you of a document in your own family, a final wish that appeared after someone died, a signature that looks faint, a notary you've never heard of, tell me in the comments. I read them. And if you want the next story, the one about the stepsister who borrowed against the family cabin and called it hers, it's waiting in the description. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it, and tell me what city you're in. Somewhere out there, a draft with a blank line is being typed, and somebody needs to read to the end. Make sure it's the right somebody. Miss Brandt, the trustee, did her work the way my father built, square and without drama. She inventoried the estate, confirmed the retirement account at $110,000, the life insurance at $250,000, and the house at $420,000. And she filed the inventory with the court where anyone, including Clarice, could read it. Transparency is a quiet weapon. When the numbers are square, the person who benefited from a lie has nowhere to stand. Clarice read the inventory, I am told, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The paper was square, and the square paper does not argue. It simply is. The truck was the one smaller wrong we could address. Miss Brandt, using the power the court had given her over the estate, sent a demand letter to Tessa for the $4,000 value of the Silverado, on the grounds that it had been conveyed under a power of attorney limited to care, not gifts or sales. Tessa did not respond. Miss Brandt then filed a small claim, and a judgment entered by default when Tessa failed to appear. Whether the 4,000 is ever collected, I don't know, and it is not the point. The point is that the conversion was named, in writing, by a neutral party with authority, and naming a thing is the first step to containing it. The district attorney's fraud unit took the referral about the notary stamp. I spoke once with an investigator, a calm woman named Reyes, who asked me to authenticate the codicil and to explain the commission lapse. I gave her the file, she said. This is a clean package. Most of these we can't prove, this one we can. Whether charges followed, I don't know, and I've made my peace with not knowing, because the criminal question was never mine to answer. My question was the civil one. Who does the paper name? The paper named me and the court agreed, and that was the victory that mattered to my father's memory. There is a detail I want to leave you with, because it is the part that still undoes me. The day Miss Brant took over, she found in the Birchwood house, in the same kitchen, the photocopy of the codicil with my father's handwritten no in the margin. Clarice had kept it, under a dish, maybe, or in a drawer, but she had kept the proof that he had refused. I don't know why. Maybe she forgot it. Maybe she kept it as a talisman of a fight she thought she'd won. Miss Brant logged it into the estate file as evidence of intent, and I have a copy, and some nights I read that single shaky no and I feel my father in the room, refusing, the way he refused a crooked cut, the way he taught me to refuse a crooked line. He built it square, he said no to the crooked version. And I, the daughter who reads to the end, made sure the square one stood. A year after the hearing, I stood in the Birchwood kitchen with a fresh copy of the 2015 trust in my hands. Clarice was in the living room, watching something on a small television, and the house was quiet in the way my father's houses always were, the way a square deck is quiet because nothing is loose. I opened the trust to the page that named me and I read it out loud, the way he'd made me read it at 15, and I said, "It's square, Dad," to a room that held only his memory and the smell of the casserole she still made on Sundays. The district attorney's office had taken the referral. Whether they charged Clarice or Tessa with anything, I don't know, and I've made my peace with not knowing. The trust was administered, the house was protected, and the blank line remained blank, which is the only verdict that mattered. Some endings don't arrive as apologies. They arrive as a document that simply never was, and a daughter who can prove it. I took the navy blazer to a tailor and had the button re-sewn, the one my father had always said was loose but fine. It is fine now. I wear it to work, and to the hearings that still come, and sometimes I lay the Ellison file next to a new one, and I see the same knot, the same blank line, the same ghost, and I do what I was trained to do. I find the execution. I read to the end. My father built decks that outlasted his hands. I build files that outlast the people who try to undo them. The tool is the same. Measure twice, cut once, and never trust a line that isn't square. The Birchwood house is still on Birchwood Avenue, and the redwood stairs still hold, and somewhere in that house is the kitchen table where he taught me the only thing that ever saved what was mine. A crooked line is a lie you can see. I saw it. I read to the end. And the law, true to his word, loved the paper trail. My father used to say that a deck outlasts the builder, if the builder respects the line. He respected the line, he built it square, he signed it while he could, he said no to the crooked version, and he left the trust that named only person in the family who would read to the end. I am that person. The watermark said draft. The line was blank. The trust was square. That is the whole story, and it is enough.